Hey guys, it's Lauren here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about the future of YA or young adult movies, but specifically the return of YA dystopian, which was a big thing back in the late 2000s, early 2010s. We all remember them, but I'm not talking about like a return to, say, like Harry Potter, which while it was a grand franchise in and of its own in a fantastic series, it's not the kind of thing that I think we need right now. I'm talking more of, say, The Hunger Games, which is probably the most exemplary example of YA dystopian at the time, you know, because there was the capital, the districts, kind of like fighting against this very, very dystopian society that was seeking to kill out and cull the population. There's also The Hunger Games knockoffs like Divergent. No offense to Divergent fans, it just wasn't as good. There was the Maze Runner. Even we could count Percy Jackson, because Percy in a way was fighting against the structure that the gods put in place for what demigods like Percy Jackson were supposed to be. But yeah, those were really popular back in the day, and we don't really see much of that happening anymore. Instead of there being dystopian lately, in like at least in the late 2010s, the mid to late 2010s, there's been more of a focus on superheroes and also just a basic focus on more of the high school setting. So for example, don't want to bring it up, but there is Riverdale, which it's something, alright. Riverdale is more of a high school focused high school drama, and it's not a very realistic portrayal of high school. I honestly don't really know what's happening with it anymore, but somehow it keeps being renewed for new seasons. We're not going to complain about that right now. There's also Euphoria, which is another exemplary show that focuses on a high school setting that does have dystopian aspects of like what it means to be a teenager today and the life of the internet and the life of finding your own sexual and gender identities. Everything like that is what Euphoria focuses on, and it does it in a sort of surrealistic kind of aspect. Grand Army, which really does go down into like the gritty and hard, dirty facts of what high school really is today. Along with that, there's also been romances that go along with the really, I guess, down-to-earth, reality-focused high school shows. At least, we're not going to talk about Riverdale, okay? But you know what I'm saying. It's more of a high school setting. There's also the romances, like To All the Boys. Gratefully, that has made leaps as well, because even though I've never really been into the romance genre, those really do bring their own, like, unique voice, and I think To All the Boys really did shift the way romance and rom-coms are supposed to be done today. So yeah, there's been all of those, but there hasn't really been any YA movies. The movies that we've been getting seem to be, again, like I said before, superhero focused, or I suppose you can say more focused on retellings. For example, Disney. Disney has been doing a lot of classic retellings lately. It kind of started in about 2014, 2015 with Alice in Wonderland and Maleficent, you know, movies like that. That started around like the 2015 era, but I think specifically around in 2019 and 2020, we saw a lot of Disney live action retellings of classic 2D Disney movies like The Lion King and like Lady and the Tramp, Aladdin, all those movies like that. We saw a lot of those kind of retellings, and I think that didn't really fill in the YA dystopian gap, because YA dystopian really had a hold on us in like the early 2010s. Instead, we got those retellings, which I think was more of a product of kind of a want for the past. Let's just say the 2016 and 2020 era was a mess for multiple reasons, including the former president of the United States. His incompetence really shined through, and I think the fact that we were all longing for like the before period, especially like the Obama period, they were trying to uphold that demand for past content by doing those sort of retellings. So that was fine, but if we're being entirely honest, a lot of those ended up being flaws, because again, there's no problem with those 2D formats, there's no problem with those cartoon classics itself. There's no need for a retelling in the first place, but it was kind of to satisfy that nostalgic feeling for when the world felt more stable instead of like kind of the shithole that we're experiencing lately. I don't know, there's just been a lot happening lately within our society. Those kind of movies, which are still coming out, there is the Cruella movie that's supposed to star Emma Stone. Those kind of movies just don't meet the demand for what's happening today. To move on to like the shift, what I think YA is probably going to do in the future, what I think YA actually needs to do in the future when it comes to young adult movies that can appeal to both teenagers, adults, children, the whole spectrum. I think that shift needs to start going more back into the dystopian. When I was researching, the main reason dystopia became popular, not necessarily just specifically in the YA era, but just dystopian in general, like 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, things like that. The main reason they became popular is because they really reflected what was happening within the present moment. It's like a lot of people tend to say, fiction does tend to be an allegory for what's happening in the present, and especially that is true for dystopian dystopian novels, for example, 1984 was written a couple of years after World War II ended. America was still very much in shock during that period and kind of exposed a lot of the governmental problems that was going on within that time. So yeah, that's how 1984 kind of came into birth. There's also The Handmaid's Tale. It was published in the 80s. There was kind of this Western want for the conservative again, with all the social movements, the more progressive movements happening in the 60s and 70s, like anti-Vietnam War. There's the sexuality movement happening within America as well, just things like that. There was a rise of conservatism in the Western world as a response, as we actually saw in 2016 as well, ironically. Just, it reflects real life events, even with the Hunger Games. To be honest, the YA dystopian back in the early 2000s and the early 2010s, that stuff wasn't really a response to anything. It was more because of what teenagers wanted. But again, even with the Hunger Games, Suzanne Collins, she was raised in this military family that was very much affected by what went on in the wars back in the 20th century. So she wrote things that reflected their own experiences, the very brutal nature of what a society can be. So we can see stuff like that. The YA of the past, it wasn't really a response to anything that was happening in the present. There definitely were some fucked up things that happened in the early 2000s, but it wasn't anything that required that much of a societal response, not like we're seeing now anyway. Like, they were more written for trivial reasons. For example, Suzanne Collins, she was writing from the kind of perspective of what her father and what her other military affiliated family might be feeling, but it wasn't necessarily something that she really experienced herself. Even for Rick Riordan and Percy Jackson series, Percy Jackson really was like rising up against what was expected of him, what was expected of people like him, dyslexic within normal society, a demigod within the mythological society. Rick Riordan really wrote it just for his son in order to feel like he belonged. Why is dystopian? I think the reason why it became popular within like that era of our lives, within the early 2010s. Now that I realize it too, my hair is kind of a 2014 hair look right now. Yeah, those good old days when we didn't really know what fashion was. Back then, like, why dystopian, I think the reason it became increasingly popular at that time was because we were more exposed to the internet. I think the problems with the world were really affecting us more as children because we had things like Instagram and Twitter and just all those social media platforms that really made... And here come the sirens. We're just gonna wait for that to go away. Like I was saying, the YA dystopian that was happening back in like the early 2010s era, that was more of a response to the way that teens were feeling at that time. Teens in general, we feel lost as fuck, bro. Like back when I was in middle school, 8th grade, 7th grade, I felt like I really was the heroine of a YA dystopian, you know? Like I wore mostly black. I got combat boots because I thought that was cool and edgy. I wore a leather jacket with red plaid on it. It was a whole era, and I felt like no one really understood me. I think YA novels at that time really reflected how teens felt, especially with the addition of the internet, social interaction, like a broader level that really does bring out most of our insecurities that we feel within ourselves. I think that really was what the YA dystopian novels appealed to back then and why they were so popular back then. Because even though we weren't feeling anything that was to the level of, say, World War II or what happened in 2020, what's happening right now in our present moment, it reflected what we felt within ourselves, and as melodramatic prepubescent children, that really did have an impact on us mentally. But now we need a shift back to something similar to that, but for drastically different reasons. I'm just gonna use Marvel as an example because Marvel, as we know, is doing very, very well with movies, television, things like that. And I think the shift that they're doing now is kind of the shift that we need within YA movies, young adult movies. That shift needs to go back to the dystopian problems within a society, an imperfect society. Let's talk about the previous Marvel era, which was actually around the same time that YA dystopian was doing so well at the time. Our first Iron Man movie came out in 2008. That came out, the main enemy was like not necessarily something that was grounded within human society, but something within the outside. The first Avengers movies, the enemy was aliens. It was Loki, who was a god, just something way far-fetched and just outside of the realm of reality. And like they said in Falcon and the Winter Soldiers, the usual bad guys that they had to face were aliens, androids, and wizards.
So I have a feeling they might be a part of the big three.
What big three?
The big three. Androids, aliens, and wizards.
You know, it was nothing grounded in reality. It had nothing to do with society itself, but more to do with protecting and fortifying the society that already existed. But nowadays, especially in the new Avengers era, yes, I am going to call it the new Avengers era. It's so freaking cool to say out loud. But in the new Avengers era, you really see the societal upset. So, for example, after the blink, you know, when Thanos did the big snap and half the world disappeared, a lot of society's problems ended up popping up within the world. So, for example, example, in WandaVision, which was a masterpiece of a television show, there are so many good things going on with it, including like the way it was shot, with the different aesthetics of the different eras within American history and American television. One of the things that WandaVision did really, really right was showing how like the government that is supposed to protect you and that's supposed to protect citizens can actually turn against you in some ways. So for example, they really tried to villainize Wanda within the television show, and hopefully this isn't spoilers or anything. I don't think these are spoilers or anything, but Wanda was really this, she was like an immigrant, I guess you could say. She was from an Eastern European country. She speaks with an accent, she's super powerful, and the government tried to just villainize her within the series by saying that, oh yeah, she's like super powerful, she's gonna be a danger to American society, so we have to imprison her, kill her, and then take her husband's corpse, which was just like really, really out of line. But that exposed the government's issues, because again, Wanda was suffering from intense loss after serving the country, actually. Despite her service as an Avenger, she still was considered this villain. Despite her mental health issues, they ignored that for the sake of their own agenda, ignoring the actual problems within the society in order to get what it is that they wanted in order to become more powerful. That's something that WandaVision, I think, really reflects well within their show, and one of the things that made it a really impactful show, along with the unique storytelling and things like that. If it's not obvious, I'm a huge WandaVision fan. But anyways, moving on. There's also the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which honestly, I don't even really have to say it, but it's trying to do the same thing that Disney did, right? They tried to bring a return to a point when the country felt more stable by bringing back this Captain America figure, literally a Walmart version of Captain America, this white man, blonde hair. They tried to bring him back in order to make the country feel more stable again, despite the fact that it really wasn't stable, because again, after the blink, just things were not doing well within the society, but they tried to bring back this Captain America figure in order to make things feel that way again. And not only just a Captain America figure, but one that looked like Steve Rogers, you know, with the white picket fence, everything like that. That was ideal in the 1920s. And then they also like brought that in contrast with, you know, the Falcon, who was again a hero that served the American country. It wasn't being treated the way that they should be treated based on his origins. He's a black man. All of that context is also just brought to the forefront. So again, it's not aliens, androids, or wizards that's the problem necessarily in these shows. It's the society itself and their thinking that really has to change. I think that's really the drastic difference between the new Avengers era, that what we're seeing right now, and the past Avengers era. And I think that difference was really marked by the movie that came out that we all knew and loved and that had a global renown, which was Black Panther, which came out in 2018, which I think really marked the age of a new sort of Avengers era, a new Marvel era, because not only was it famous because of its black cast within this ideal utopia version of a country in Africa, but it also kind of exposed how society itself could be the problem. Wakanda was this really utopian society, right? Like they had a king, they had this limited resource which would make them really rich and which made them entirely self-sufficient. They weren't interfering in outside countries and outside countries weren't interfering in them, so they were able to practice and do basically whatever it is that they wanted, and they really had like no restrictions. They were living this really idealistic African society. But then the fault within that society, it wasn't any sort of outside force, it was the faults within the society that caused them to want to change. So for example, Killmonger, a villain that wasn't really a villain, someone that a lot of us really identified with because of the fact that he was done wrong by the society, not only by American society, but by the society that like rebuked him and called them not one of them, and kind of just brought up the fact that there were probably lots of other people like him within that society and within American society that needed Wakanda's help. That kind of thing that explored just the intrinsic faults that could happen within your own country. Black Panther, it was amazing for multiple reasons, but that was definitely a big part of it. And basically seeing the problems within the society, I think that's something that needs to be brought up again, which brings me back to the main point. Why dystopia needs to come back. Things like the Hunger Games, things like Percy Jackson, all of those really need to come back, which is part of the reason why I'm really excited for the Percy Jackson reboot. But also, they need to come back not in a reimagined kind of way. I don't want it to be related to Harry Potter, which quite frankly wasn't even a dystopian. Harry was kind of the hero that was supposed to bring order back within the society again. They were fighting an outlandish conservative sort of enemy as opposed to the enemy within, which the Ministry itself had many faults. I don't get why some people are trying to get a reboot of Harry Potter. We've seen enough, especially with a transphobic author. I think we're good. Things that are going to be adapted as why dystopians, or things that I think should be adapted as why dystopian. One of the big ones I'm really excited for that's coming sometime in the next 10 years is Children of Blood and Bone. If you didn't know, Children of Blood and Bone is this YA fantasy dystopian novel by Tomi Adeyemi. It follows this girl named Zelly who is dark-skinned with white hair, and she is essentially like this magical being within society. society of magi. Basically, her people have been suppressed by her own society. They are prevented from using magic. They've basically been killed, exterminated by the government, and just incredibly mistreated. But eventually something happens. Her village is put under assault by the government, and she realizes that she has to fight in order to get the magic back and return the magic back to her people. That story has been picked up by Lucasfilms and it's going to be adapted into a movie, which is incredibly exciting, not only because it's a YA dystopian which reflects more of what's happening now, but it's a YA dystopian which stars a person of color, a black woman, which I think is incredibly important for storytelling, because I think one thing that was missing from the YA dystopians from the 2010s and from the early 2000s era was the fact that they focused more on when the grand majority of society was being affected by society's problems. I apologize, the camera cut off, which is just so typical. So typical. Like I was saying, one thing that I think is different from YA of the past that's really present in YA today is that it's not the majority that's being mistreated, it's the minority that's being mistreated, and the minority have to rise up and bring attention to their own issues. Like we said before, it's kind of similar to the situation with Wakanda within Black Panther. Simulated this idealistic society, most people are getting off just fine, but when the minority of people are being affected and they end up fighting back, it really just exposes like how big the problems within the society actually are. Another example of this kind of dystopian take is The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. If I were to summarize the story into a few words, it'd be Black Amazons. Hello. It follows the story of the protagonist, who is the girl on the cover. She and other women within society, if they bleed gold blood, then they are essentially marked as demons within society, and they are forced to be executed. It's because they contain powers of like the late gods and things like that. Society has deemed it dangerous within the past few years, and therefore they have been treated very horribly. They've been raised to believe there's nothing wrong with the way they've been treated by society, but they still very much are feeling the effects, like, for example, death. Again, these are just like a few women with a certain type of blood type. It shows the minority of society fighting back and kind of exposing their own problems and how their own problems actually affect the larger amount of society. Again, it's another instance of that. Instead of it being the majority, it is the minority, and I think that's really the shift that we're going to see in YA fiction. Another book that I think should be adapted, Legendborn, which, in case you are new to my channel, this was my favorite book of 2020. Again, it's a piece of YA fiction and slight dystopian. It follows this girl named Bree, who, while attending this early college program within North Carolina, is trying to figure out how and why her mother actually died. And in doing so, she kind of exposes some of the intrinsic faults of this fantasy society that takes place within the contemporary world. It's a contemporary fantasy. But yeah, again, it's the minority kind of fighting against the majority, exposing the faults within society and the faults especially within the past of the society. Those are all themes that all of these books incorporate, and again, they're all books that involve POC. And I think that's really the thing that we're gonna see. We're gonna see a lot more, at least specifically for me. One thing I'm looking forward to seeing a lot is a lot more Black fantasy. Hello. It's something that a lot of us have wanted for a long time. I did a little bit of research and trying to find some Black fantasy books. A lot of them aren't necessarily fantasy, they're sci-fi, and again, it's not young adult, it's adult. And it's very brutal. It's not necessarily as fun. It just doesn't have the same caliber as the dystopians or fantasy movies that we saw within the 2000s and the 2010s period. Now, there's plenty of books like the ones that I just showed you guys that are doing a similar thing to what the books back then were doing, except they star POC and therefore give a different context. Because instead of it being the majority that are being affected, it's like, oh yeah, this is an obvious problem you have to fight against. It's focusing on how like the problems within society, they can focus on a minority and then largely impact the rest of society based off of that. So that I think is incredibly important when it comes to this form of storytelling. I think the future of YA dystopian and the future of YA movies in general, it's going to be focused on fantasy once again, and it's going to be focused on the stories that people of color have come up with, because there's plenty of them out there. I can literally list a million. Watch any of my past videos. I've read so many of them and I've enjoyed so many of them. They're all there and they're all just waiting to be grabbed up by these studios, and I'm just really excited to see it. Fiction really does kind of present itself as an allegory for what's happening within the present, and I think another reason why these stories are going to be more adapted and why they're going to star people of color and why exactly they're going to be like the future of YA movies is because of what's happening in our present day. Within the last year especially, I think the problems within our society have become very very apparent. Essentially, COVID-19 was our blip. It was our Thanos snap. It really was the thing that not only transformed society, it really showed us the cracks within it. Because even Donald Trump, a lot of people were just like, oh, we can just like live through it, it'll be fine. It's not going to be that big of an issue. The COVID-19 happening along Donald Trump's presidency, along with the increased highlights on police brutality against Black people and other people of color, I think all of that explore the need for dystopians once again. Because I don't think after seeing things like that, we want to see retellings. Like, oh, remember the good old days. No, the good old days were actually really problematic. Even the Obama era, there were still plenty of systemic problems going on under his watch. I think now there's been an increasing demand for some sort of really fundamental change within society, and I think that's why dystopian is going to come back, especially with these stories being present right here. There's literally plenty of them. I can make a whole video on dystopian starring Black girls that I really enjoyed. I think I can do that for you guys if you want. But yeah, I think because of everything that's been happening in the past year, I think why dystopian is going to come back is going to come back better than ever. And that is all for this video, and I am out of breath. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, you should like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on my medias, they'll always be linked down below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.